Hello, everybody, and welcome to this online event. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to tell you about this author and this book, which I had the pleasure of reading recently. Jyoti Patel is the author of The Things That We Lost. It was published on the 12th of January, and it's her debut, which is kind of remarkable because when you read the book, you'll be blown away by the writing. It's told from the perspective of 18-year-old Nick or Nikhil and also Nick's mother, Avani. It jumps between the past and the present as Nick searches for answers surrounding his father's death. Jyoti came to publishing in not the most ordinary of circumstances. Well, let me just tell you how. She submitted an extract to the Murky Books New Writers Prize, and over 2,000 entries, Jyoti was the winner. The Observer very recently named her one of the 10 best debut novelists of 2023. She joins the likes of Douglas Stewart, who wrote Shoggy Bane, amongst other things, and Sally Rooney in having achieved this accolade. Before publishing this book, Jyoti was, amongst other things, a graduate of the University of East Anglia's creative writing program. Now, before I introduce Jyoti, I said at the beginning that I thought that she was a beautiful writer, and I'm just going to pick out. I really struggled to prepare for this because there were so many things I wanted to point out and talk about. So we'll have to try and squeeze as much in as we can. But I wanted to start off by just reading you one sentence. And this is about youth, young people at the start of their lives. The wide expanse of life was waiting for them, yet unwritten, and so gloriously full of possibility. That line, outside and inside of context, gave me tingles, and it gives me great pleasure to now welcome Jyoti to join us for a conversation.
Hi, Mohsin. Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you for writing the book. It was so moving, and there are so many layers to it. Before we jump in, I have given my introduction of the book, but I think it's always lovely to hear very briefly from the author about what they think the book is and what it means to them. So I'd love to start with that.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, The Things That We Lost it's been described as like a coming of age story, family drama. It's full of family secrets. People have described it as like a story about belonging and love and friendship, and identity. And for me, it's all of those things, but it's also really a story about resilience and specifically the different kinds of love that exist. And it follows, like you say, mother and son, Avani and Nick. When Avani's pregnant with her son Nick, her husband tragically dies. And then 18 years later, as he's growing up, he's trying to figure out the circumstances of his father's death and piece together his family story. So yeah, we follow both mother and son. And it also flits back to like the 70s and 80s when Avani's growing up. So we almost see them growing up alongside each other.
Yeah, yeah. And where did the idea come from? And I guess baked into that question is how much of your own personal experience is in the book.
So it's definitely a work of fiction in that the characters and the things that they go through are totally made up. But I think the reason I wrote it was definitely because when I was Nick's age and into my early 20s, I was grappling with lots of the things that he grapples with in the novel, specifically the identity piece. So he's mixed race, and a lot of the book is about this balancing of how British or how Indian, specifically for Nick, how Gujarati he is, and the way that when you don't have the privilege of, growing up in the country that your cultural heritage is tied to, how you do balance those two things, and the feeling of being too Indian or too British or not enough of one or the other. That was something that was the center of the book when I first started writing it. And then it became about lots of other things as well. But that was really what sort of got me going when I wrote the very first chapter. And family is a really big thing in the book too. And although the family is totally nothing at all like mine, I think that was something that I enjoyed the most about writing the book is the family element and the secrets within the family and the way that I reveal those to the reader.
You talked about the mixed heritage identity, and I'd like to ask you a bit more about that, if I may, because it was what I loved about the book was the way in which you navigate the fact that your protagonist, or one of your protagonists, is not just one thing. He's at least, he exists in at least these two worlds. And like even the name you chose to give him, right? Nick versus Nikhil. Is the mixed heritage experience, is that something that it was important for you to bring to the book? And if so, why? Because actually, on one argument, you could have just had a South Asian family, right? And Nick's parent, Elliot, I mean, I'm not giving you any spoilers here, he passes away. And one of the central themes of this book is, actually, I don't think it's quite grief, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong. I don't think it's quite grief. I think one of the central themes is how you deal with the aftermath of grief or of somebody passing away. But Nick's biological father is English, and so why was that important?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And I did think a lot when I was writing whether I make Nick just in terms of his identity and his heritage fully Indian, or if I do make him mixed race. And the reason why I chose to make him mixed race is because I wanted to add that extra layer of complexity to looking at a mixed marriage in the 80s. So when we're back in the past and Avni's getting married to Elliot, she can't see any other mixed couples. And she doesn't know what a Hindu wedding is going to look like, being, a bride with Indian heritage and then marrying a white British man. And back in the 80s, 90s, when they were falling in love and getting together and getting married, like that was a time where, it was sort of starting to happen more. I wanted to look at that piece. So that was the first reason why I wanted to look at a mixed couple and the difficulties that come on both sides in the 80s and 90s, when people were falling in love and getting married outside of their own cultures. But secondly, when it came to Nick himself, I really did want to look at, because a big theme in this book is also mental health, and I wanted to look at the historic silence around mental health when it comes to white men in Britain, and then also the silence around mental health when it comes to South Asian culture, and in this instance, Gujarati culture, where we don't even have words for mental health or depression or anxiety or panic attacks. And I wanted to look at what happens when you have a character or a man who's struggling with these things that he can't articulate, and he's literally a marriage of the British silence around mental health and the Gujarati inability to even acknowledge it. So that was when I was like, he's definitely going to be mixed in terms of his heritage, because I want to look at this marriage of silence and how difficult it would be for a British man or an Indian man who's struggling with his mental health.
Yeah, I mean, I must say that I found some of the experiences of the main characters really harrowing, and I thought that you dealt with them with such sensitivity. And what I commend you for is the way in which you were able to shed light on abuse, both in the white working class experience, but also in the South Asian experience. And I think actually we don't see very much of that. And I'll explain a bit more for those that haven't yet read it. Avni, one of the other protagonists, so that's Nick's mother, Avni suffers from serious mental and physical abuse at the hands of her mother, which becomes even more pronounced when she decides to marry a white man. Were you worried at all about portraying a South Asian family in this way? And that's not a loaded question by any means.
It's a really good question, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot now that the book's out and I'm doing interviews and like I'm talking about it more. And I think like I think there's lots of parts of this book that I wrote because I didn't see it represented in the literature I was reading. So you've touched on a lot of that already in our conversation,
Yeah.
like, with Nick and his mental health and etc. And one of those things was just Gujarati families and South Asian families. And I think it would have been really easy to write a book um, romanticizing the culture and showing only the good parts of the culture, because there are good and bad parts of every single culture. In this story, I show a lot of the great parts of Gujarati culture, but I also show what happens when you have characters who they themselves hold like a lot of resentment. So, like with Avni's mother, a lot of I don't really go into it too much in the book, but I sort of hint at, a lot of her resentment of her daughter is tied to this fact that she sees her daughter assimilating and being free in a way that she never could. And that causes a great deal of resentment. And I don't want to excuse the abuse or explain it because, people are abusive for many reasons, but I certainly think that's part of why she is the way she is with her daughter. And there is a lot of, unfortunately, trauma in South Asian families, specifically the diaspora who moved to the UK during, like this family does, the same year as Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, in the 70s, late 70s, in the early, hold on, I need to say that again, in the late 60s and early 70s. And so I wanted to show, what it's like and the trauma of, the twice migrant journey. This family moves from India to Kenya to England, and that's a difficult thing to do. And often, the way that we perform our identity then in the generations, it changes.
Yeah.
Of course, it does. We all perform our identity differently, and in this instance, and in many instances in real life, that does cause a lot of friction between the generations, which is also something that I look at.
I wanted to pick up on something you just said about I don't mean to excuse or explain away mental health and or kind of abuse. It's interesting because actually explaining it or interrogating its origins is not to excuse it. And I think what you do so well in this book is you demonstrate where those experiences come from. And so Avni, at the hands of her mother, is subjected to, as we've discussed, some terrible abuse. And actually, although Avni is not the same with Nick, there's definitely a complicated relationship between them as well, right? And what I loved was the way in which the way that you could see that Avni is as a parent, she is the product of her own upbringing.
Yeah.
And was that, I mean, because it was so effortlessly done. And I guess my question is, how did you manage to achieve that? Was it intentional, or was it just was it something where you kind of in the edit you were like, okay, I need there to be a thread here, or was that just how it came out?
So I think the reason why it came out the way it did, and it feels quite in your, in your words, like smooth. I don't actually think that's what you said. What did you say?
Effortless.
Effortless, that was it. It feels quite effortless, is because it took me so long to write the thing. So like I started writing this in 2018, and these characters were with me for like a good 3 or 4 years up until the final manuscript was done. And I think because they were with me for so long, I really got to know them. And to talk a little bit more about that and to tie it back to your question, for example, the scene that I think with Avni and her mother that everyone talks to and refers to is the horrific scene sort of halfway through the book,
Yeah.
where we see her mother physically and very much emotionally and mentally abusing her. And it's it was a very difficult scene to write, and it's still a difficult scene to read back. And it's the first time I'd ever written anything sort of even semi-violent, ever. And I wrote that scene because I wanted to understand more about the exact nuances and details of what was going on between those two characters. When I first wrote the book, I knew that there was abuse there. I knew that Avni was, like you said, a product of her past and was doing her best not to like put the same things onto her son. But of course, sometimes when we parent, we try our best to do the opposite of what happened to us, but then by definition, we go too far in other ways.
Yeah.
And we do other things that aren't ideal. And which parent is ideal,
Absolutely.
But with Avni, like I very much wrote that scene because I'm part of like a workshop group where we like read each other's work and provide feedback. And I think someone had said to me, we need to see really what's going on between these two characters. And I wrote this scene and it was never meant to be in the book. But when I gave it to my friends to read, they were like, this is incredibly powerful, like it needs to be in there. And it's still now, I think, literally the only scene in the whole thing that's barely been edited from like when I first wrote it.
And you
Um,
really mean for it to be in the book?
no, I just wanted to get to know them. There's so much of the novel, there's so many scenes and conversations between characters that I wrote that never made it through, but I needed to know I needed to write those scenes and explore those moments within the characters to then make them feel rounded and whole. And often, lots of the scenes that I omitted, like there's lots of really tender scenes between Rohan and Nick when Nick's a kid. I summarize them in one line, very like potent one lines in other chapters. But within those lines, there's so much detail that I know. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. Is that so? I must say, I've not, I've come across lots of writers that have written a bunch of stuff that gets edited out, me being one of them, and then thinking, oh, there goes that weekend that I spent writing that entire chapter. But I haven't come across, and I think it's remarkable, the idea of saying, actually, this isn't going to be in the book, but I'm doing this because I need to know my characters even better than I do now.
Yeah. And I think this book is like,
Where did it come from?
yeah, and it is like a very character driven book. It's
Absolutely, yeah.
very much character driven. And, the plot only really starts going about halfway through. Like the first half is very much just a slow getting to know the family and sitting within like the aftermath of their grief and stuff. But
I'm going to just interrupt you there and say you're doing yourself a disservice. I think that, I mean, it is definitely a character-driven book. The plot starts at the beginning. And what I love about the way you write is you draw the reader in. You draw them into this world. You want, like, I started reading it. And funny enough, the very first thing that I mean, I'm going in so many different directions and I apologize, but there's so much that I wanted to cover today. But like on the very first page, you have a young woman who has a tattoo of India on her ankle. And I don't know why, but as soon as I read that, I was like, and you say nothing about it. You say nothing about it other than that it exists. And I was like, okay, this person speaks my language. This person is going to be able to communicate really effectively, but kind of neatly some of the nuances. And I felt like that was one of them. But sorry, I interrupted you. But just to say that actually, I think the plot gets going from the very start. But then what keeps you there is the characters.
yeah.
I mean, as well as the plot.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that because the plot was something that I really struggled with when writing, and I think it's nice to know that the reader doesn't feel like that. That wasn't your experience reading it, but for me, like when I did read it back when I was editing, I was so aware that it really picks up in pace in the second third, and that was because this was definitely the sort of book that I started writing because these characters and these sort of vague ideas were around me, and I wanted to explore something through these characters, but I didn't really know where the plot was going to go, where we were going to end up. And there were a couple of different endings I was playing with. But, some writers have like everything planned out perfectly and they know exactly what the arc of every single chapter is going to be and what the point of tension is going to be and what the come down is going to be. And it's all very neat and tidy. But for me, it was very much like a messy getting to know the characters first and really sitting with them for a couple of years and then adding the plot in. But it's really nice to know that it sort of works in the final product.
One thing I'd like to ask you about is your decision not to translate or to italicize the Gujarati words. And I'm particularly interested in that, as a South Asian writer myself, who was kind of figuring out what words to use and not to use. In particular, there's the word mamu, which means uncle. And so I was writing about an uncle, and the reason I use that example is because I want to talk to you about Jand in a minute. But I decided that I was going to not use the word mamu and I was going to use the word uncle. And actually reading it back, when I read your book, I thought, I wish I'd been brave enough to do this. So what gave you that courage and why did you decide to do it?
So thank you firstly for sharing that. And yeah, it was a couple of things that happened all at the right moment for me. So I was doing a master's at the University of East Anglia, and I remember one of the one of my peers on my in my workshop group. So the course sort of works that you sort of meet once a week, like 10 of you with a tutor, you share work, you give each other feedback. And one of my peers in my class was a British Pakistani writer. And I was italicizing the Gujarati food because there's so much food in the book.
Oh, made me so
Yeah, me too. When I read it back, I'm like, oh, it's really, yeah, lots of delicious food. But I was italicizing because as you can see, I read a lot, and all of the books I'd read, every time there was a word from another language other than English, it was italicized. That's like, the form and the way that you're taught to write because it's how you read.
Yeah.
And he said to me, don't italicize because you're othering your own language. And that's all he said. And I was like, oh, and I almost felt like I'd been very like told off, but in a really good way. Like the way he said it cut through me. And I was like, I just got it. I was like, yeah, absolutely. And then during the same course, one of my tutors handed me Nia Wickway Parks's Tale of the Bluebird, which is a really beautiful novel set in Ghana. And the writer moves between English and Tree, and he doesn't italicize the tree when he's writing in Tree. And he doesn't, in fact, sometimes he italicizes the English, which I really liked.
Love
If, yeah, he
that.
like switches I loved it. And that novel really gave me the confidence. And, you described it as brave. That novel gave me the bravery to think, okay, like this is something that I could do. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, like so much of this book I did because I hadn't seen it done before, whether it was the male mental health, whether it was the mixed race character dealing with identity, whether it was the trauma and the grief that these characters were dealing with. Like I wrote everything that I couldn't see growing up in books. And I thought, why don't I extend that to the form itself and the way that I'm telling the story? And it was really important to me not to provide a glossary of the words, to include Gujarati food without the italics, to not translate the Gujarati directly. And every time there is a little phrase in Gujarati in dialogue, somewhere on the page there will be a way to understand what's happened. But I didn't want to I wanted to do it subtly without saying, here's the English translation, because I wanted Gujarati and English to hold equal weight in the book. I didn't want to be othering my own language. I didn't want to be pandering to the kind of reader that we've been taught we need to write for. I wanted to be writing this book for people, for everyone, but specifically for people like, the people I grew up with and people like me and the people in this book who would recognize something in it that they haven't traditionally seen on British bookshelves.
What I loved about that decision was that in so many ways, growing up as minorities, we are conditioned to lean in, conditioned to take the extra step to make it more convenient for the majority. And the most powerful thing for me in that decision in your book was to say, no, this story, this writing, these characters, they stand in this space. And you, the reader, will come to meet them here. They will not come to meet you. And I thought that the confidence in not just that decision, but in the plot and in the characters and in your writing, it just shone through. There's so many. I keep saying this. There's so many things I want to ask you about because there is. I was going to ask you about. I need to ask you about the uncle John in the book. But first, I want to touch upon grief. And I was trying to think of a really kind of thoughtful way of saying this because I'm somebody who has lost somebody close to me. And I found your writing meditative in terms of the way in which not just we as individuals respond to loss, but the way in which families respond to loss, but in particular, the ways in which those reactions, those emotions can differ to such a great degree. Mm-hmm. And the question that I'm trying to find an elegant way of asking, but I'm going to fail, is have you gone through that depth of grief yourself? Because to me, I mean, regardless, but to me, it felt like you must have done.
So to answer, I think grief is something that for me as an author, as a writer, has always interested me. And I remember in my early 20s, I, for example, lost a grandparent. I wasn't as close as Nick is to his grandfather in this book, but it was the first taste of grief that I experienced. And in the years following, a lot of my close friends were losing their grandparents too. And I remember for the first time in my life, like seeing how much it can transform you. But I've also been interested in other kinds of grief, like the sort of grief you experience when you lose at the end of a relationship, or the sort of like collective grief that we all experienced during the pandemic. Like this idea of loss and losing parts of ourselves has always interested me as a writer. And the thing in particular that interests me is how nuanced every person's experience of grief can be. So, whether you're losing someone you've known for a year, it can move you so profoundly, or you could lose someone that was on the periphery of your life and you've known for 50 years and it has a lesser impact, but you can never really tell how it's going to impact you. And it's one of those things like the mother and child relationship, which I also look at in this book, which is like a thumbprint, like it's always going to be unique. Every type of grief you go through, or every mother and child relationship, both of those things are always going to be very deeply nuanced. So it's something that I think writers historically have always been drawn to, and it's something that I continue to be drawn to, is grief. So to answer your question succinctly, like it isn't something that I experienced tragically like Avani does in this book, but it was something that really has moved me in my life when I've seen people around me experiencing it and the times I have experienced it. So I just read every single book I could about grief, and I researched it as much as I could. And again, I think the reason that it felt quite moving in the book is because it took me so long to write. So I kept going back to it and adding extra layers and trying to make it as complex and believable as possible.
So, sorry, there's so much that you've said there that I'd like to pick up on. And I will get to the question about the uncle in a moment. One of the reasons why I think you did such an excellent job on grief is because of the way that you dealt with ownership of the emotion of grief, ownership of loss. Who gets to have that emotion? Who gets to own it? And the reason that resonated with me is because, at least in my experience of South Asian culture, there is a sense of hierarchy. There's a sense of who gets to be the most upset about something. And then you kind of go downwards. Who is the center of this experience? And then who's in the inner circle? Who's in the outer circle? There is this hierarchy that, I mean, and I'm sure it kind of exists in different cultures in different ways, but my lived experience and your lived experience and the lived experience in this book is the South Asian experience. And what I wanted to ask was whether you think that's right and whether that's fair. Do you think that the ownership of any emotion, whether it's love or any relationship, whether you can stake a claim, a primary claim over something? And I'm probably being quite abstract, so I'm just going to explain for the people that have not read the book that essentially Elliot, Nick's father, dies when Nick is not even, like, I think not even born. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Or he's not born yet. And so then there's almost this kind of battle over who gets to own this emotion, or who gets primary ownership. And actually, it's not just between the protagonists, right? That's where Chand comes in as well, and other characters, other friends that were friends with Elliot and Avani when they were younger. Do you think it's a normal part of human existence that there is a hierarchy to the ownership of emotion?
So I'm really glad that you've asked me that, because no one has yet, and it's something that I'm really keen to talk about. So thank you. But one of the things that kept coming up when I was reading all my many books about grief was this idea of the territorial nature of grief, which is what you're describing. In the sort of theory around grief that I was reading, people referring it to as the territorial nature of grief. And I think specifically when you lose someone tragically, by which I mean it's not like a lovely, quiet old age death, where someone's lived a long and happy life, but when you lose a child or a loved one or whatever tragically, this idea of territorial grief does seem to crop up for a lot of people. And again, it's an emotion that a lot of people don't want to confront. They don't want to talk about it, which is why we haven't seen it in fiction so much to this extent, really. And it was something that I wanted to pinpoint when I kept quietly hearing it in the podcasts and the books I was reading. And yeah, so in the book, it's very much Avni sees Elliot's death as the thing that she feels most territorial about. Because also, don't want to give any spoilers away, but it's clear from fairly early on that she feels some sort of blame or guilt around it. And everyone as well has their own version of what happened to him. So, like the other characters you were talking about, John, who knew him, Maya, who was Elliot and Avni's friend as they were all growing up together, they all seem to hold different versions of Elliot in their memory because, of course, their relationships with him would have been nuanced and very unique. So the version of him that now exists in all these people's minds is going to be quite different from each other, right? Because it's based on their relationships, which are nuanced and complicated and unique. And then again, the way that they respond to his grief and what they choose to believe about the way that he died. So all of this stuff was so interesting to me, and it was something that the deeper that I dug, the more I was mining, the more I was like, this just gets more and more interesting from a psychological point of view. So yeah, it was something that I think you're right, like it exists in so many cultures in so many ways. And it also very much exists in the South Asian digestion of grief and processing of grief. But it's also something that was coming up a lot in the British realm of how people are socialized and conditioned to process or really not process tragic grief. So yeah, it was something that was very interesting to me, and really a lot of this book I wrote because I was interested in the psychology around lots of the topics. I was interested in the psychology around the mixed race identity experience, in the experience of what it feels like to be British Indian, what it feels like to lose someone tragically. I was interested in the psychology around these things, which is why it's such a meditative, like you said, and character-driven book in the end.
One of the things that I love when I read a book is when your experience of what you're reading helps you understand why the book has its name. And sometimes book titles are really clear and obvious, and that's fine. And at other times they're quite abstract, or you don't really understand what they mean until you've really finished the book. And the experience I had when I kind of finished was a sense of looking at the front cover again and thinking, wow, there are so many ways in which this title speaks to the experiences of the characters in the book. And and it also kind of speaks to the experience that you as a reader are left with, because at least how I felt after finishing was encouraged to think about loss and relationships in my own life. And I think when you read a good book and it pushes you to do that, that's such an impressive thing to have achieved as a writer. So congratulations. But I will stop rambling and get to my question, which is, where did the title come from? And did it come first, at the end, in the middle? I'd love to hear more about what it means to you. And then, very tiny question, did you ever think about dropping the that as well?
So love that question, and thank you so much again for your such kind words. Like it really means a lot. So thank you. And when I first started writing this back in the day in 2018, it had another title. It was called Six of One, and it was based on the idiom of six of one and half a dozen of the other, which is this idea that two things are equal, right? And that I think tied into lots of the conversations that happened towards the end of the book, specifically when Nick wants a solid answer about his father's death and etc. And also the way that he grapples with his identity. But we quickly learned that not a lot of people know what that idiom is. And people kept referring to it as like one of six. So it was actually I was very open from the start of the process. I was like, I don't like the title. It was a placeholder. Can we change it? But everyone else seemed to like it. It was only then when we started talking to readers and stuff that the Murky team and Penguin were like, yeah, I don't think it works. And I was like, I've never thought it works. Give me some more options. And it was actually my editor who we were almost, I mean, we were quite a good way through the edits, and the book looked very much like how it looks now. And she said to me, "How would you feel about this title?" And I literally just got goosebumps. I was like, it took me 100,000 words to explain what I wanted to explain in this book. So I couldn't, if I'm honest with you, probably more like 160 if we think about all those chapters we were talking about earlier that never made it in, that I wrote for myself. But for her to have succinctly summarized the whole thing in 5 words, I was like, you really get it. And I'm really like, yeah, I was really moved, and I did get goosebumps. And that came from my editor. Sorry, that came from my agent, because we were all in the room together. And I said, should it be the things we lost or the things that we lost? And my agent was like, no, it should be the things that we lost, because it's like, it's actually correct English and it's more literary.
Oh, is that why? Okay,
yeah, so the book came from me, the title came from my editor, and then that came from my agent. So it was a real team effort. But like you say, like the more, I mean, I loved it as soon as she said it, because it summarized so much of the book and so many of the themes. But, you know, it also, you think about the things that we lost, and you immediately think about Avni's voice talking to her son about they've lost their granddad, they've lost Elliot. But also, like, you think about her parents when they came to the UK, they would have left so much behind and lost so many parts of themselves in doing that. And when you lose things, you find things, you make space for new things. And yeah, I could just go on about the title, but it's just the perfect title for the book. And it's the one thing that I can't take credit for.
Well, I think you can take some credit for it, because the title wouldn't exist without the emotion that you provoke in all the people that read it.
Thank you.
Uncle Chand. This is one of the storylines that I adored.
Okay, thank you.
The relationship, the kind of the narrative arc of that relationship is there is a texture to it that you don't often feel in books. You know, that you've got somebody who is not a main character interacting with the protagonist, and then suddenly there is this moment, and I'm not gonna spoil it, but there is this moment where they are in the same room, and you're kind of blindsided because you don't think that journey is going to take place the way that it does. And then when it does, you surprise yourself as a reader by wanting it to move in a certain direction, right? You're suddenly, and it becomes the center of the book for that moment, right? You're kind of lost to everybody else. Avani kind of goes out of focus. Why was that important? And actually, before you answer, the other part that I wanted to ask about with Uncle Chand is around Avani and Chand's childhood. But actually, you know what? Start with that question, and then I'll go to Avani and Chand's childhood. Otherwise, I'm going to bombard you.
So thank you so much. Chand was someone who I really wanted to look at in terms of, like, I introduce him at the start of the book, and he's wearing Doc Martens, and he's obsessed with Nirvana, and he's got his denim jacket, and he's just like free as anything. And then we meet him in the next chapter, and he's aged, you know, like, I don't know, like 30, 40 years. No, he's aged, my maths is so bad. This is why I'm a writer.
I don't think I can help you with that, I'm afraid. He's a grown-up. He's got kids.
Significantly, decades have passed. I don't know how many decades. Decades have passed. And he's just like a horrible, quite difficult man. And you just can't understand how he's gone from this boy who's full of life and so in love with life to someone who's so disillusioned by everything and so miserable in so many ways. And the thing is that I can see so many people like that in the real world. And I didn't want him. He's the one character that I think could at times almost look like a cliched Indian uncle. And the reason I wanted him in there was because I know so many people like him, and it breaks my heart, but I know so many people like him. And through this book, I wanted to explore how someone becomes someone like him. How do you go from being a child who's full of wonder to a man like that? What has happened to him? What complexities, what quiet traumas has he lived through? And that's what I wanted to explore in the book. And that's why in the moment you're describing, everything else does fall away, because for a moment you see all of him. And he lets you see all of him, and he lets Nick see all of him. And I wanted to show, because that is really like the sort of the height of the book in many ways, is that moment between them. And what it is it's a moment of platonic tenderness between men.
Yeah.
And I had not seen that growing up in films, in TV, in the books I was reading. I didn't see men allowed to cry with each other, to put their arms around each other, to console each other, and to be vulnerable and emotional and delicate with each other. And I really wanted to show two brown men doing that to each other and for each other in this book. And it's the same with all of Nick's mates, like the tenderness he's shown by like Dan at uni, or even Tio and Will and Papa Burns, all these men who show him kindness and tenderness and love. I wanted that to exist in a book because it exists in real life, but we just don't ever get to see it in fiction and in art.
There were many moments when I was moved by the book, but that one in particular, I'm not ashamed to say, made me cry, because I was because the idea of these two South Asian men embracing it was extremely powerful. But before we get to that point, and I suppose I've taken these in the wrong order perhaps, but before we get to that point, you almost for a while feel as though Jand is complicit in some of the abuse to which Avani was subjected. And I suppose that speaks to a dynamic within South Asian families where even amongst siblings, there isn't necessarily always an alliance because of this idea of primacy over relationships that we spoke about earlier. But the book starts with Avani and Jand as friends. And then you kind of almost see it unravel. Or you see some of the background and then you jump forward. It feels like Jand was at times complicit in the abuse to which Avani was subjected, albeit silently so. And I think that this draws upon the idea of there being a primacy in relationships. And again, I can only speak from in terms of South Asian culture, the idea that siblings don't necessarily have an allegiance because the allegiance is primarily towards the parents and the mother. Was that intentional, the idea that there would be this chasm between them?
Yeah, 100%. Something that I kept coming across again in all the theory that I was reading, I'm really into psychology and relationships, and I was reading and listening to a lot of podcasts about how, two people can be standing side by side watching a horrific car crash, and the details that they remember can be totally different, from the color of the car to who walked out of it. And people process difficult things and remember them so differently. We're constantly rewriting our own memories. And I've seen people do this myself. Like, I'll experience something with someone and I'll see the way they tell the story. And then there's this Gujarati thing of always adding a bit of mitu and marchu, a bit of salt and spice to it. And rewriting the memory in your own mind. And then the next time you tell it, a little bit more spice has been added. And I was also interested in the idea of like siblings going through things and remembering things differently, and what you choose to remember and the stories you choose to tell yourselves in order to process things. So like we talked earlier about a really difficult scene between Avani and her mother. And I think a lot of what you're referring to is the fact that Chand remembers that differently to the truth of it, because it's easier for him to believe a lie than to accept what's going on. And even though in the moment he helps Avani and he shows her how to climb out of the roof onto the garden, etc., which proves that he does know what's going on.
Yeah.
When they talk about it, again, bad maths, but 10, 20 years later, at the height of their, the chasm that you mentioned and their breakup as brother and sister, essentially, he tells her that he's remembered it differently because in all those years, he's added layer and layer and layer to this story in order to hold it, because he can't hold it when he knows that his mother is abusing his sister. He can't hold that. So he adds things to it to make it easier to hold. And yet again, like to summarize, like the psychology behind the stories we tell ourselves and the way that we process traumatic events and the way that we even just process memories, and specifically the way that siblings can go through things in a family and experience things differently and then remember things differently, just was so interesting to me psychologically. So yeah, it was something that I wanted to explore in this novel, which I do
And then
think.
he makes a sacrifice for his sister. So the great thing about the relationship between them is all of the complexities and the layers. And again, I don't think it's a spoiler to explain what that is, which is that essentially she wants to marry a white guy. And so in order to make sure that his parents at least have one child that does what they expect, namely to marry somebody of the same faith and same cultural background, he decides to marry somebody Gujarati. I mean, there are so many different versions of that experience that have taken place in the South Asian family, right? So we talked
Yeah,
about there being no allegiance, but actually there is no overt allegiance, but then there's this silent one that he never speaks of until very
exactly.
much later. Um, where did the idea for that come from? Because I think it's an extremely powerful one.
Yeah, it's something that I've seen so much, just and not that exact experience, but the experience in families where siblings, it doesn't even have to be in this experience, and it's very much tied up to the South Asian and Gujarati family, but I've seen it also in other families of other cultures where siblings have grown up in a very sort of closed mindset of their parents expecting them to do a certain thing. And there's always this thing of like the older sibling or the younger sibling or one of them having to take one for the team. Essentially, you see it in so many ways when there's this profound love between siblings. And I wanted to look at what happens when you have, Chand, when we meet him, and he's so like open-minded and free to the world, but he looks at Elliot and Avni and he knows that their love is something that's really deep and profound, and that his mother is not going to accept both of her kids doing this. So he does say, and he's deeply in love with Poppy, who's mentioned, but he decides that he's going to marry Rukmini, who's a lovely woman that his mother introduces him from her temple, and he's very happy with her, and he has three beautiful children. And but he lets go of this whole part of himself, and he almost from that moment becomes someone else because he
Mm.
chooses to leave the young Chan behind and almost the person he wanted to be, and he very much dutifully accepts this other role that's been put onto him so that his sister can live the life that she wants. And then there's this resentment that buds between them, which she never understands, until the moment where he says, I chose to marry Rukmini so you could have Elliot.
Mm.
And yeah, it was something that I could just see happening so quietly in so many different situations, and it again kept coming up for me that I wanted to explore it. And it was something that I looked at quite late in the relationship between them because I
Mm.
needed to understand what was going on. It was something my editor was saying to me, like, what's really happened? And I said, it's not one thing, it's the weight of many things between these two. And I needed to explore what those things were. And one of the weightiest bit was this.
So we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask you a question about race. Then I'm going to ask you a question that I reached out to a bookstagrammer to ask on, because I thought it'd be fair to try and bring in some of your fans, of which this bookstagrammer is one. And then finally, I'm just going to wrap up. So race. Now we could have spent an hour talking about race, and to be completely honest, race, although you deal with it in this book and you deal with it very well, there are so many different complex layers and the relationships and the way that you write that I didn't want the focus of this conversation to be race. But I also didn't want to ignore it. One of the things I'd like to ask you about is the use of the white voice. And you say that Nick at one point realizes that he's using his white voice. What did you mean by that? And why was it important to include that concept in the book?
So that was something that I noticed that I was doing a lot when I was growing up. I would go to Northwest London where I was brought up, where Nick's brought up, and I would speak very, very colloquially with my friends and the way that we'd grown up and the way that we just speak to each other in slang and very relaxed. And then I'd go home and speak to my mum in a mix of Gujarati and English, see my grandparents speaking Gujarati. And then when I found myself in very white spaces, I would change the way I spoke in order to essentially assimilate and fit in.
Mm.
And it was something that when I realized I did, it's code switching. That's what we're talking about, is code switching.
Yeah.
And when I realized I did it, I felt this huge sense of like, I'm being so disingenuous. Which one am I? Why am I doing this? Like, I have to pick a voice. How can I go from speaking Gujarati to my grandmother and speaking a mix of Gujarati and English to my mum, to speaking, to my mates in Northwest London, to then speaking in this RP accent? Like, how can I be all those things? It can't be right. And like Nick, I realized in my early to mid 20s, no, it's absolutely okay. It's okay to speak in a variety of ways, and it's okay to have to, in the same way that the words that we use when we speak to our best friend aren't the exact same words we'd use when we speak to our boss.
Yeah.
But for Nick, like, he realizes that it becomes almost a shorthand for when he's in spaces that he feels safe in, versus when he's in spaces where he feels like he has to perform a certain part of his identity more. And that's what I was trying to hint at in that book, because there's a moment where he is with Paul, who is his stepfather, and he realizes he's using his white voice, which is the part you were referring to. And I wanted to almost show the reader that he doesn't quite feel like Paul's family. He doesn't almost feel like he's safe and that he can speak in the relaxed way that he speaks to his mates. He's performing, he's in this position where he has to be on as opposed to relaxed. So, but it's something that I think, I've read about. I think it came up in a great book called The Good Immigrant, by Nick S. Shukla.
He's the editor. It's this collection of essays.
Yeah, which is great essays. And I was reading them whilst I was writing this, and I returned to them, and I love that book so much. And it was something that I noticed in that book, and it kept coming up in conversations I was having. And it's something that I do, and I think most people do when again, you don't have the privilege of growing up in the country that your heritage is from. So yeah, very rambly answer, but I hope there was some.
No, that made complete sense. So actually, it's on the subject of race that if I was going to present a gentle challenge to you, it would be this. And this is, well, let me give you the challenge and then I can perhaps explain. Nikhil, when he goes to university, experiences overt racism at the hands of one of his fellow students. And so much, almost everything that you write about has a nuance to it. And it felt to me as though maybe this relationship didn't. And I wanted to know why. But before I bring you in to actually answer, I wanted to give you the background to it, which is that when I read it, I thought, is this realistic? And then I thought to myself, well, actually, I experienced overt racism at university. So then I caught myself and thought, well, okay, well, clearly is realistic. But what was it that, I don't know whether it was my own sense of, wanting to feel like I belong, that made me want to say, can this be right?
Mm-hmm. I think, that's a really interesting question. And the reason as well why I set this, like, Nick's fictive present in 2017, 2018, is because I wanted to juxtapose that moment to like Avani growing up in like 70s and 80s when like the NF were out and there was a lot of overt racism. Yeah. But the moment that you're talking about when Nick's at uni in 2017 was like, for me as a brown person who was living in rural England at the time, I noticed that there was a quiet overflow of validation of like quiet racism that was happening because of like a lot of the rhetoric and the propaganda around Brexit that was happening at the time. And that's why I chose to set it in that moment, because I wanted to look at that moment versus the overt racism in the 80s and 70s. But with that specific character, I think, I wanted to look at what happens when you ignore microaggressions, because he hands Nick a bunch of them quietly, one by one by one. And Nick just ignores them. He's just like, whatever, I'm not going to stand up to this guy. He can piss off. Well, excuse me. I'm not going to stand up to this guy. It just popped out. He can, he could do one, but he doesn't actually fully stand up for him. And the fact that he doesn't stand up to him really weighs on him. It weighs on him that he doesn't stand up to him. But I wanted to show for the reader who wouldn't have picked up enough by those microaggressions, because there will be those, there will be readers who see those microaggressions and be like, oh, it's just a bit of fun, all of that nonsense. I wanted to show them and spoon feed them and say, this is what it will lead to, which is overt racism.
Right.
And I didn't want to give that character nuance because he doesn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve nuance and complexity. People like that exist, and I've dealt with them, and you've dealt with them, and we will unfortunately probably deal with them again. They don't deserve nuance and complexity in literature, unfortunately. So they didn't get it.
Fair.
That's just the short answer.
No. I liked it. Okay. So at Real Book Things, who is a bookstagrammer, who I personally think Naila, her name is a wonderful reviewer of books, and not just because she's also reviewed mine, but she did this lovely review of your book, and it made me think it would be nice to have somebody else's voice in this discussion. And so I reached out to her and I said, look, if you were going to ask Jyoti a question, what would it be? And she came back with 5, and I was like, okay, look, I'm going to limit it to 1. But what is your favorite book that you think is underrated, and in my language, that you think is slept on?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. That is an excellent question, because lots of the books that I fell in love with when I was writing this now are quite well rated, which is really good, it's really lovely to see. Do you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to take it back to what we were talking about a minute ago, and it's The Good Immigrant, edited by Nika Shukla, because so much, and I don't think that book is underrated, but I think it's compulsory reading in my mind. Like, everyone should read that book, because in many ways, it's the non-fiction version of like a lot of what we've been discussing in like the last sort of 10 minutes. It shows really and truly in practical ways what it means to move through Britain as a brown or black person, or someone who's a minority, or someone who is an immigrant. And I think, it got quite big a couple of years ago, but I think it's a book that should just be compulsory reading, because it was the first time that I felt so seen when I read a book. And it was also the book that gave me a lot of the bravery to write this one and not shy away from the decisions that I made to be really like candid with the way I wrote this book. I got a lot of the strength of that from reading The Good Immigrant. And I think there's also a US version, isn't there? There
is. Okay, finally, what's next?
So I'm working on my next novel.
Great. I'm as a fan of your writing, I'm very pleased to hear that.
Bless you, thank you. It's also going to be a story about a Gujarati British family, and it's going to be set in London too. There's also going to be family secrets, but it's going to be a lot lighter than this book. I think it's still hopefully going to be beautifully written and character driven, but it's going to be a lot lighter, hopefully a lot funnier, and it's going to follow a female protagonist in her sort of late 20s, early 30s. So yeah, I think families and secrets are just my vibe. So there weren't enough in this book, so there's going to be some more in the next one.
Okay, well, on that note, Jyoti Patel, thank you so much for being in conversation today. The Things That We Lost is out now, and you should read it because it is a beautiful, beautiful book.
Thank you so much. Honestly, it's been such an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I am also a massive fan of your book.
Oh, no, we can edit that out. We don't need to plug
edit it out. Honestly, this book was one of the books that moved me the most when I was reading it. So, and I've recommended it to so many people too. But honestly, it has been so great to speak to you. And we've touched on so many things that I haven't touched on in other interviews before. So thank you for like engaging with the book so much, and for such a lovely conversation.
Honestly, I feel like, I really wanted to ask about Paul, and I didn't have a chance to ask about him. I really wanted to learn more about the relationship between Avani and her, was it Maya?
Yes, Maya.
The kind of jealousy between, there was so much that I wanted to cover, and I was like, I don't know where to start, because usually you're like, okay, I'm going to start here and then just chronologically go through, but there were so many different threads to pull on. So congratulations, and I wish you all the success which
Thank you so much.
Deserved, really.
Thank you. It honestly, I can't tell you how much it's meant, because I've been such a fan of your writing and your beautiful book. So it means a lot.
let's keep in touch. If you're ever in New York, we're gonna have to go for lunch, and when I'm back in London, we should catch up.
Please, I would really love that. I would really love that. Thank you.